Alrighty everyone, thank you for joining us. We're just about to get started on our CSG webinar, but just a few things. If you experience any problems, please call the number that I've provided in the chat box. Otherwise, you can ask any questions throughout the webinar via the same chat box. Otherwise, let's get started. I'll hand it over to Daniel Phipps.
Thank you, Kaylin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel Phipps, and I'm a Coal Seam Gas Project Officer here with AgForce Projects. Can everybody hear the sound okay? If you have any difficulties, please just type it in the type box, or if my voice is not coming through clearly, please let me know. And again, if you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, just please type them in the box or call the 1-800 number. This afternoon's webinar is about the negotiation right through to rehabilitation and remediation process of the coal seam gas industry. It's important to point out that this workshop webinar this afternoon, the information that is provided is for Queensland landholders only. Any landholders or representatives from other states that may be listening, just please be aware that the legislation and a lot of the components are only relevant to Queensland, but it's important that any questions or issues that you have, you direct those to your relevant state body. The project that we deliver is provided with the support of the Queensland Government, the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, the Queensland Resources Council, the Gasfields Commission Queensland, in partnership with AgForce Queensland. The webinar this afternoon is being recorded, and we will provide a copy of the presentation to all participants who registered for the webinar this afternoon within the next week, and it will also be made available on the AgForce Projects website within the week as well. Any questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to ask them, or feel free to contact me after the webinar. This afternoon's webinar will go through some aspects of interpretation of legislation, and it's important that any landholders who are going through the process are aware that legal advice is a critical component of this industry, and information provided from this webinar and also to any other workshops that we provide must be used in support with other legal professional advice as we go through the presentation. The topics that we'll be covering this afternoon, and I'll do my best to stay on time, we'll go through an industry update as well as some of the future activities. I'll also be going through the Make Good framework and some of the long-term predictions for groundwater impacts, as well as where to obtain industry information and some of the information portals that are available to landholders and stakeholders. I'll go through the process of negotiating an agreement right through from the initial process of entry notice right through to the end of development and operation process, as well as providing some points to consider during the negotiation process, as well as important conduct considerations. To provide a bit of an overview of the CSG industry in Queensland, the predominant location for the industry is in the Surat Basin, and the Surat Basin is part of the Great Artesian Basin in Queensland. The target seam that the companies are trying to access is called the Walloon coal measures, which is actually made up of a number of different coal seams. In order to get the gas to flow to the surface, the coal seams must be depressurised, and part of that depressurisation process is about removing the water that is also held in the seams, which keeps the gas there in situ. This has issues related to the interconnectivity of aquifers that sit above and below the coal seams, and as we'll go through in the presentation, this will impact on some aquifers of the GAV and also is predicted to impact some landholders' water supplies. The Bowen Basin, or the Southern Bowen Basin, north of Roma, Thuringian and Taroom, is the target area for activities in the region. The formation that companies are targeting is called the Bandana Formation. The Bandana Formations are deeper and older sediments than the Walloons, typically about 850 to over 1,000 metres in region. The closest GAV aquifer to the Bandana Formation is the Precipice Sandstone, which is separated by the Rewan Formation, which is actually a major aquitard. And an aquitard is basically a sedimentary layer that actually restricts the movement of water and pressure between aquifers. And as we move forward, we'll explain how that relates in terms of groundwater impacts. Throughout the development of the industry in Queensland, we've seen significant development over the last 4 years, and since the project started in 2011, we've had a significant increase in the number of wells across the basin. And according to data obtained in October this year, there's just over 8,000 wells in Queensland at various stages of development. And it's worth noting that approximately over 5,000 of those wells are production wells that are pumping gas or that are ready to start pumping gas once the pipelines are completed. What this signifies is a significant expansion in the industry, but that also peak production of the industry is really yet to occur in terms of the number of wells that are actually required to be drilled. And estimates are that you can see over the lifespan of the industry, the total number of wells may range between 18,000 to 40,000 wells, with industry continuing to readdress and advise that number to probably be closer to the 18,000 well number. As you should be seeing on your screens now, this is a map that shows the spread of these wells and also the 3 target formations that the industry are working in. The Surat Basin in blue, the Bowen Basin in green, and the Galilee Basin in pink. The black dots are wells that existed up until, or were drilled as of 2011 in April, and the red dots represent wells that have been drilled since April 2011 up until this point in time. And we can see significant development and expansion throughout the Surat Basin, but also development occurring in the southern and northern Bowen Basin regions, and some exploration also occurring out in the Galilee Basin. So as I said, this is approximately 8,000 wells right across the state, and the estimates are that that number will significantly increase as the industry continues to develop. In terms of the companies, to provide a bit of an update, the 4 major companies are Santos, GLNG, Origin APLNG, QGC, QCLNG, and Arrow Energy with its Surat gas project. QGC and Origin have their approvals in place for their development programs, and Santos GLNG has actually just released its second environmental impact statement for comment as of this week, and which they're seeking an additional 6,100 wells on top of their current number of wells that they have approved. It's anticipated that this future development in the Santos tenures will occur as on the map to your right. The blue areas are the existing developments, and the green areas are the new gas field developments. And the additional wells under this second phase of the project will come from a combination of infilling existing fields and also developing new fields. So it's important that landholders are aware of the development of this project. You'll also now see on your screens the planned production tenures across the Surat Basin. The map on the left, in the blue squares are tenures that were in production as of 2012, and the yellow squares are tenures that are planned for production across the lifespan of the industry. As it can be seen, signifying significant development and expansion of these production areas across the basin. And the right-hand map shows the breakdown of company tenures across the area. A great place to start as landholders or stakeholders is to use one of these 3 portals. The Coal Seam Gas Globe, which is part of the Queensland Government Queensland Globe, Mines Online Maps, which is a portal that replaces the Interactive Resource Tenure Mapping portal, the IRTM portal, and also the Groundwater Bore Search, which I'll talk about in the next section. The CSG Globe and Mines Online Maps will allow landholders to look at the tenures that cover their property to find out which company holds that tenure, when it was applied, when it was granted, and when it expires. And it'll also allow them to look at any CSG wells that have been drilled, the date they were drilled, and by which company in the result, as well as linking to other documents such as the bore report or the well completion report, which allows you to understand exactly what was drilled, to what depth, and what the results were of that information. The My Mines Online is also a portal that can be used by landholders to find all resource information in Queensland. So not just CSG, but all resource information in Queensland. So coal, minerals, and production leases as well for any landholders dealing with other tenures. I'm now going to go through groundwater management, and I'm going to talk about the Underground Water Impact Report and the Make Good process. In 2010, the Surat Basin Cumulative Management Area was declared, and it was declared as a result of the government recognising that there was a lot of interaction between the different tenures across the Surat Basin, and that the cumulative impacts of groundwater impacts do not stop at the tenure of a company. Therefore, a region-wide model was required to be developed. The model you can see on the map goes from Toowoomba west of Roma to almost Mitchell and as far north as Emerald, and it captures the main CSG activity in Queensland. It's important that landholders recognise that whether they're tenure or off tenure within the CMA, that the landholder rights are the same, and it's important as we go through the process to bear that in mind. So once the management area was declared, an underground water impact report, or a UWIR, was required to be developed, and was developed by the Queensland Water Commission, which is now called the Office of Groundwater Impact Assessment, or OGIA. It took a whole bunch of data from CSG companies, various government departments, the old DERM groundwater database and other agencies, and developed a cumulative impact about predictions to groundwater suppliers. What the model has done is it has developed and projected an immediately affected area, which is impacts to bores which are likely to occur within 3 years of the model, and a long-term affected area, which are impacts which are likely to occur into the future past that 3-year period. Now, the model was released in 2012, and it's a requirement that a new model is developed every 3 years, and as such, next year in 2015, a new underground water model will be developed and released, and it will show new predictions. What that requires as a result of the model is these immediately affected area bores, which is the bores within 3 years. A make-good agreement must be negotiated now, and the long-term affected bores need to develop a make-good agreement before those impacts are predicted to occur. Now, the immediately affected area, as you can see on your screen now, initially identified 85 registered bores to be impacted as a result of CSG, and that all of these bores source their water from the Walloon coal measures, which is the target theme for CSG in Queensland. Now, what has been required is that these make-good agreements be entered into, and that also bore assessments be completed to ground truth the model predictions. As you can see on your computer now, the CSG globe has this groundwater data included in it, and I encourage all landholders in the area to log onto the globe to have a look at the model and to look if their bore is included. If anyone has a bore that's identified in the immediately affected area, they've already been contacted by the company and are in the process of negotiating an agreement. The long-term affected area, which is the second area predicted by the model, is where the impacts start to increase, as we've seen. And the model released in 2012 indicated that 528 registered bores were identified in these areas, in the long-term area, and the bores in this area source water from the Walloons, the Springbok sandstone, and also the Hutton sandstone, representing that there is a degree of interconnectivity between the Walloons and the above and below aquifers, and these are likely to experience some impact as a result. The long-term affected area, the tenure holder, which covers the impacts, is required to undertake a bore assessment and develop a make-good agreement prior to those impacts taking place. And as you can see again on your screen, this data can be seen on the Queensland globe, and landholders can actually look at both the immediately and the long-term affected areas. The large rings represent the drawdown contours for that aquifer. So the Walloons in black, the Springbok in blue, and the Hutton sandstones the Springbok in red, and the Hutton sandstones in blue. The individual circles around bores are the bores that have been identified within that model. And what landholders can actually do is actually click on that bore, and it will show you the registered number of that bore, the purpose of that bore, but it will also provide a link to the Department of Natural Resources and Mines website. And basically this is the data that landholders can see. Again, it shows the number, the formation, and also a description of the impacts that are likely to occur. It shows the long-term predicted impact, and also shows the responsible tenure holder that is required to develop an agreement with those landholders. So we strongly encourage landholders in the area to get onto the globe, have a look at the tenure data, have a look at the groundwater data, and use it as a starting point. In terms of what make good actually is, so make good is an agreement that is separate to a CCA, and a CCA is a conduct and compensation agreement, which is an agreement between you and the resource company, which I'll discuss later. And the make good agreement requires the company to develop an agreement where there is likely to be or is starting to be impaired capacity of that bore due to their CSG activities. And as you can see on your screen, there's various different options that are available to companies and landholders, and it's important that landholders are aware that this is a negotiation that they are entering into. The offer provided by companies is not the final offer, and it's important that landholders consider the make good measure that's been negotiated for and make sure that that make good measure is actually going to be effective for their short and long-term productive requirements of their property. For areas that are outside that cumulative management area, so in the further northern Bowen Basin or into the Galilee Basin, the Water Act still requires companies or tenure holders to enter into make good agreements after an investigation that there is deemed to be an impact to that bore as a result of CSG. And baseline assessments that landholders can do prior to CSG activity being undertaken on the property is an excellent point of a reference point to provide some impact or to provide some data pre-impact to be able to develop an agreement to show what this impact is likely to be. Any landholders that have a bore that they think is experiencing an impact as a result of CSG, regardless of being within or outside either of the modelled areas, the landholder rights are the same. And initially, we strongly recommend that you raise the concerns with your responsible CSG company. And if you're not sure who that company is, if they're not on your property, what you can do is you can either go onto the Globe or Mines online maps, or you can contact me and I can find out which company has the tenure of your property. If you're not satisfied with the response that you get from the company, you contact this coal seam gas compliance unit groundwater investigation team, and their details are at the bottom of the page, number and email. What you'll provide to the company is they would then be directed by the regulator, which is the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection, to do what's called a bore investigation. If after the investigation the bore is found to be impacted by CSG, then the company will be required to develop a make good agreement with that landholder and then develop a suitable arrangement to supply an alternative water supply. It's important that landholders recognise that during the negotiation process for exploration on their property, that they're strongly encouraged to negotiate with the resource company to have a baseline assessment of their bore completed prior to those exploration activities taking place, particularly drilling or other intensive activities, and recognise that the company should also develop with you an ongoing monitoring strategy to look at the ongoing monitoring of the bore for the duration of those activities. Being able to provide a longer-term picture of the bore condition is a much more important fact than just providing a snapshot of that bore condition at that baseline assessment time. Now, I have gone through the water process quite quickly because the focus of today's presentation is the land access and negotiation process. But if there are any questions on groundwater impacts, please feel free to ask them now. We do also do a number of groundwater field days, which we provide more comprehensive information. One of the questions which has come through is who determines whether the bore has been affected by CSG. So to answer that question, the bore assessment investigation is directed by the department, and the coal seam gas compliance unit works in close collaboration with the Department of Environment and Heritage Protection. What the compliance unit may do is they may direct the CSG company to do an investigation themselves directly and provide information to the compliance unit groundwater team, or the groundwater team will actually come out and do an assessment on your bore as a landholder and actually do the investigation. Now, it's important that landholders are aware of this process in terms of the investigation may only be an initial investigation, and it's important to recognise that the result that is determined is not necessarily the final result. And landholders are encouraged to contact and work with the compliance unit and also the company representative to actually determine the impacts. And if it is determined to be an impact as a result of CSG, then the department has directive powers which can actually require the company to develop a make good agreement and develop an alternative measure with the landholder. One of the other questions was who pays for baseline assessments. So if the landholder who's being approached to develop an agreement for exploration of their property, there's no legal requirement at the exploration stage for the company to do a baseline assessment or to pay for a baseline assessment. Once the company moves into production, they're required to do a baseline assessment of all bores within the production tenure. What we strongly recommend is at the exploration stage that part of your negotiation for the conduct and compensation agreement that you actually require the company to do a baseline assessment of your bore. Now, some landholders are happy for the company to do that testing themselves, or in other circumstances I've been involved in, the landholder will choose a groundwater consultancy that they believe they would like to do the testing, and the company will cover those costs if it's negotiated. But it's important to understand that if you don't ask, you won't receive. We'll move on now to the land access and negotiation phase of the workshop. It's important that landholders recognise that there's been some changes over the last few years in the land access process, and some of landholders' experiences over the last 5 or 10 years will be prior to these new laws taking into place, and it has changed things quite a bit. So it's important to recognise that for the majority of properties across Queensland, the resources found under the surface of the earth, the right to manage those resources is reserved by the Crown. And any landholders who are unsure should check their property deed and title to make sure that that actually is the case. So what that means is that the government has the authority to provide the authority to a resource company to come and extract those resources for the benefit of all Queenslanders by charging a royalty rate. But in order to get to those resources, the resource company must negotiate an agreement with the landholder, because you still own the access route. You own the access route they need to put the infrastructure on, and unless they go to land court to obtain a determination to come onto your property, they can't get access for those advanced activities. Now, there's a few processes that are undertaken in this process. The first step is called the entry notice phase. Now, the entry notice phase may be the first and only contact that the landholders have had with the company, or it may be the first interaction that they've had with the resource company. This process is something that is written very clearly into legislation, and it basically provides a stepped framework in order to gain access to a property. So an entry notice is only valid for 6 months for exploration activities, and it's for what are called preliminary activities, and these are activities that are designed or determined to have little or no impact to the landholder, but also the property. So as it says in the example, they're things like taking soil samples by hand or walking tracks, fauna flora surveys, nothing that is likely to have an impact to the property. Anything like building tracks or drilling wells is what's called an advanced activity. So at this entry notice phase, there's no requirement, unless the property fits into some categories, and being organic or biodynamic is one of those categories. An agreement, a conduct and compensation agreement, is not actually required prior to entry. So the entry notice can come by mail or in person, and when the entry notice is provided, the landholder must also receive a copy of the relevant resource authority, so that showing that the tenure covers their property, the land access code, and also a full copy of their environmental authority, which is the real book that takes place. As you can see on the right-hand side, the entry notice must be issued a minimum of 10 business days before the company would like to gain access to the landholder's property. So even though a signed agreement is not required at this stage, landholders can absolutely have a say and should have a say about the activities that are going to be taking place. And one of those important things is to consider the entry notice timeframes and making sure that when the company would like to gain access to your property, that it's not going to be an interruption to your business. So coming and providing an entry notice 10 days or 2 weeks before you're about to start mustering or harvesting is not an appropriate time to be gaining access to your property. So what you would do is you would go back to the resource company representative and you'd say to them what is a suitable time that suits you, and you make sure that they comply with that time frame. And if you don't get a compliant result from the company representative, then what you do is you come to the Coal Seam Gas Compliance Unit. It's important that even at this entry notice phase, you understand exactly what those activities are likely to be and also what the impacts of those activities are likely to be. So basically asking who, what, when, where and for how long. Also, biosecurity has become a particular concern for landholders in this industry, and making sure that you ask the resource company to explain to you what is their washdown process, where will they be accessing the property, where will equipment be coming from, and will they be accessing the property from areas that are high risk or from neighbouring properties that also may be high risk. Wet weather is also an important thing to take into consideration, making sure that the company representative calls you at least 24 hours to make sure that the road conditions are acceptable or that they're actually drivable without doing any damage before they come onto the property. It's important to note that there's no requirement to sign an entry notice at any stage, and it's also important to understand that under the Act, at this entry notice phase, there's actually no provision to provide for legal costs to be covered and paid for by the resource company at this entry notice phase. Once we move into the negotiation phase, absolutely at that process. And this is the second step that we go through. So some landholders will go through the entry notice phase and then proceed to the advanced activity phase of negotiating an agreement, where other landholders will go straight to the negotiation process. So this is what are called advanced activities, and these are activities that are likely to have an impact to the business or to the property, and it's for all those advanced activities, so track construction, drilling wells, seismic operation, realigning fences, and these activities require a conduct and compensation agreement, or a CCA, must be signed before those activities can be taking place. And it's really important that people understand that during this process, it's critical to seek professional advice, and seeking professional legal advice is something that we strongly recommend throughout this process prior to signing any agreement. On the right-hand side, you can see that this is actually a stepped process. So after the entry notice process, the negotiation time frame starts. And it's a minimum period of 20 days before an agreement is signed, and the company can come on and do their activities in the first example. In the second example, after the 20-day period, either the landholder or the resource company may refer the matter to mediation or alternative dispute resolution. Now this may be a conference with the compliance unit, or it may be a meeting with an independent mediator. And it's important that landholders who have been referred to this process by the company or by themselves are aware of who is required to pay those costs, and also to negotiate initially that landholder time is covered and paid for as a direct result of these activities taken away from your business. So after the conference or mediation process, if an agreement is signed, then the company can come on and do their activities. In the third example, after going through the negotiation process and the mediation process, if an agreement still isn't reached, either party may refer the matter to the land court, and the land court will then make a determination about the agreement, and the company may come on and do their activities. What is critical to understand is that in this process, the time frames that are set down are minimum time frames for negotiation. They're a base point to start from, and they're not a ceiling point to the negotiation process. So there's no 20 days is the maximum time to negotiate. It's very much open to the individual circumstances that you and the company are working through, and a lot of agreements are stretched out past this point. And that's why landholders need to be aware of this time frame to exercise their rights, to not be pushed into a time frame faster than they need to understand. Some important considerations about conduct and compensation agreements is that they are as they sound. They have two distinct components: conduct provisions and compensation. Some important points to be aware of is that your CCA, as I'll call it, attaches to your land for the term of the agreement. So that if you sell the property, the agreement actually goes with the property and does not end with you as the owner unless you negotiate otherwise. Therefore, we strongly recommend that landholders with their solicitor negotiate either a time frame to that agreement, so the agreement is for X number of years or for X activities, and also look at including a review period into the agreement to make sure that the agreement is periodically reviewed through those activities to make sure that it's working effectively, or that conduct provisions that you've negotiated into the CCA are actually working adequately. And an example may be that during the construction phase, where the most impact is likely to occur, putting a negotiation period every couple of weeks or every month during that construction period to make sure that you revisit things like washdown requirements or dust provisions or contractor behaviour is actually a review period that's actually negotiated into your agreement, that you sit down with your land access representative to make sure that you review it and make sure that it's working properly. As you can see, necessary and reasonable legal, accounting and valuation costs that are incurred to negotiate an agreement must be paid for by the resource company. And it's important that landholders are involved in this process as much as you can be through the negotiation phase, and that you're sitting there with your solicitor, that you're sitting there with the company representative, and that you're aware of how the negotiations are progressing, and making sure that what you're discussing is actually what you'd like to occur on property, or that what you're talking about in negotiations is actually something that makes sense to you. And it's important that you work with your solicitor to make sure that they take the time to explain this to you properly, and making sure that you're proceeding at a rate that you're comfortable with, and that also the negotiation is actually something that you're comfortable proceeding with. At any point during this process, you can contact the compliance unit for any technical issues that you have or compliance issues that you have with the resource company, and you can also contact me with any advice questions that you'd like. And the service that we provide through the funding that we have is available to all landholders free of charge. What we'll go through next is some of the property-specific provisions about negotiating an agreement, and also just to make you aware that regarding compensation, there are specific what are called compensatable effects that the resource company is liable to compensate you for as the owner or occupier of the land. And they're shown on your screen, and they're quite specific things. What's important to do is that with your solicitor and with the other professional advice that you're working, so your accountant or your land valuer, for example, that you actually look at this compensatable effect, and you look at the impacts that are expected or that are likely to occur, and making sure that the compensation that you're seeking can fit under one of these different categories. If you have disputes about the compensation that the company is offering, obviously it's up to you and your solicitor and your land valuer to work with the company to reach a medium point or an agreement that you're both happy with. If that can't be done in that instance, then the compliance unit can be brought in as an independent mediator to go through that process and reach an agreement. If still an agreement can't be reached, the Land Court will make a determination about that process. One of the tools that we strongly recommend is important to landholders to use is a property map, and whether this is a digital computer map or whether this is a hard copy map, it's a great tool to use as an example to look at the impacts that are likely to occur from those proposed activities, and also be able to use that as a tool to demonstrate developing better conduct provisions or actually determining compensation. So in the example you'll see on the screen, this is a example that we've developed of a property plan showing, for example, you can see paddocks, water courses and roads. We've put in cropping areas, irrigation hydrants. We've also identified areas of future development, and we've also developed and mapped areas where weeds is an area of risk on that property, or, for example, accessing your property from a neighbouring property that doesn't have very good weed procedures and using that as a tool. So all we can see is by using the property map, we can actually start to develop and start to see impacts that are likely to occur. And you can use that again as a tool to be able to substantiate either a better design for the activities on the property or location of those activities, but also determine compensation. So we can see in this example, land segregation is a particular concern where roads or pipelines may be segregating paddocks. Potential for surface water contamination with multiple access routes across a creek that may flow into your dam, and it's easy for surface water to become contaminated from excess dust settling on that areas. We've also mapped out any restricted future development, so improvements to your property or property plans that you have that you're looking to develop your property. Any activity from the company that is likely to restrict or impact on that future development is actually something that you're entitled to compensation for, and using the map and talking with people like your banks or with your grazing consultant or with your agronomy is important to understand that process. We've also mapped weed risks on the property and looking at areas where there are outbreaks that you're concerned about, or from flood overflow areas where it's likely that there'll be an increased impact as a result of those activities, is likely to be something that should be negotiated upon to actually be able to remove those cases. Some other agreement considerations is to actually really look and define and specify what are those activities. And it's very easy to look at activities as just being 5 wells on a property or 10 wells on the property. What's important is to actually look at that cumulative impact of all of those activities and to actually list out specifically what those activities are and what the likely impacts of those activities are likely to be. So looking at not just how many wells, but also how big are the wells during construction versus in operation and also remediation. How many kilometres of roads and what are the widths of those roads? Are there any right-of-ways on those roads? Similarly with pipelines, the depth that pipelines are buried to. Are there any weight restrictions over pipelines? Looking at other areas like turnaround or laydown areas, and also considerations of how the wells will be powered once they move into operation and production. One of the biggest concerns for landholders is that vehicle movements and the dust that's generated from those vehicle movements. So it's important to understand prior to these activities taking place to list out how many vehicle movements are expected and for how long is that vehicle movement expected to take place, and the dust suppression techniques that the company would like to employ, and do they actually meet your requirements as a landholder. And it's important to understand or to look at the impacts from dust settling on pastures from prevailing winds and what restriction that may make to the palatability of that grass or stock. Like we've also listed, the length of activities and what happens in wet weather is a particular concern of landholders. So it's a process of asking the resource company what their procedures are and making sure that their procedures meet the requirements of your property. And if they don't, then you need to negotiate procedures that actually meet the conditions. Based on assessments of roads, weed burden, surface water and groundwater is also a particular point about looking at the impacts that are likely to occur, but also obtaining a condition of the property pre and post any impact and being able to provide a bit of a baseline around that process. Liability is a particular concern landholders need to be aware of, but also, like I said, the timing of activities. So will activities be taking place when you're harvesting or calving during drought periods? At the moment, it's not a very good time for activities to be taking place. So working with the company to make sure that these activities occur at a time that's actually appropriate for you. Like we've mentioned earlier, it's important to understand exactly what happens with the agreement in terms of covering all activities. So is the agreement simply for exploration activities? Is it for production activities? Is it for all activities, including the rehabilitation of those activities? And making sure you understand moving forward how long is that agreement valid for. Some of the rehab conditions we'll speak about in the next section, particularly looking at once we've moved to rehabilitation, how those processes be addressed.
I'll just interject here, Daniel. We have received a question about land court. Just because of time constraints, we'll just keep moving on, but we will address your question later and hopefully be able to answer it in the post-webinar email.
Thank you, Caitlin. To provide just a quick answer to the question about the land court, under the new land access laws, there's been a number of matters that have been referred to the land court since 2010, but to my knowledge, none of those matters have actually been sat and listened by the land court and actually set down a precedent about these activities or about the land access laws that we're talking about. So at this stage, the laws have not been tested by the courts. Some of the biosecurity considerations to take into point is a particular concern for landholders, and on the 2nd of December, I'll actually be in Miles delivering a biosecurity field day with representatives of AgForce, the National Livestock Biosecurity Network, the Coal Seam Gas Compliance Unit, as well as Western Downs Regional Council, and we'll be talking about biosecurity considerations and also concerns for landholders. So if anyone is interested, you can register on the AgForce Projects website. A baseline assessment of weed condition is a very important consideration for landholders to take into place. And prior to the access being granted to the property and those activities being carried out is a very good idea. Some of the points to consider about a baseline assessment for weed condition is to look at the time that the inspection is taking place in relation to growth periods and also seasonal conditions. Now, scouting parties and with the company representatives themselves will often come out to scout the site that they would like to develop and drill upon. I would recommend that the landholders go with the scouting party and with their representatives of their environmental team to actually look at the current weed condition and weed burden around those activities, and not just looking at the site that they'll be developing, but looking at access points and access roads and a buffer around that access roads and those access points to make sure that you can understand and the company can see what is the current level of weed condition, and as a result of their activities, do you then have evidence to be able to substantiate impacts on those activities. Landholders really need to look at negotiating with the company, or at least asking the question about what is the washdown procedure that the companies have, and particularly putting some goalposts around washdown certificates is also a good idea. So considering the kilometre reading when the vehicle was washed down, the date and who inspected it and what was included in that inspection, but also the area the vehicle has travelled from. So whether the vehicle was washed down in Wandoan and Taroom and then driven down to Kogan, for example, and where has the vehicle been along the way. Some other considerations that you should take into negotiations is looking at the weeds that are a risk to your property. Now, the Land Access Code does set down mandatory provisions for resource companies to comply with in regards to weeds, but what they talk about is weeds that are declared pests and weeds. So landholders that have spent years and years and hundreds of thousands of dollars removing undesirable pastures from your property to only have those native species or other species that are not necessarily declared weeds but are a hindrance to your production operation enter to the property because of incorrect washdown procedures. So making sure that the company is aware of what's a weed to you is not necessarily the same as what is a weed to the resource company. We also look at traceability of biosecurity is also in particular interest, and some people have gone down the avenue of developing vehicle registers for vehicles and staff, but also developing their own induction processes about inducting staff and contractors to the conduct provisions specific to their property, but also the ability to inspect vehicles and also be compensated for for the time that you take away to inspect those vehicles. When we look at all the information you go through, it's important to develop a strategy that actually suits your requirements. And the example we see on the screen here is that we've gone through and we've developed a design that actually looks to minimise the impact to the property. Even though this is a highly unlikely scenario, what it represents is a starting point for your negotiations to look at, well, what are the impacts that you're required or that you're willing to accept, which of the designs actually minimises the impact to your property and your productivity and future activities, and then you use that as a point to negotiate and start upon. It's not recommended to start from a point you're necessarily willing to accept. You start from a scenario or a circumstances that is the best case scenario for your property. With conduct and compensation agreements moving forward, it's important that it's always been a case that confidentiality is not a mandatory provision, and that any landholders that have old agreements that have been signed over the years that has confidentiality included in those agreements need to be aware that that's not a mandatory requirement, and just need to look at whose interest is that provision in favour of, and is it something that you actually want in your agreement. And if you don't want it in your agreement, then you're absolutely within your rights to approach the company to renegotiate to have that confidentiality removed. And if you have any issues or difficulty having that confidentiality removed, you can obviously go to the compliance unit, or you can come to the projects team to assist. When there is a material change in circumstances or those activities, a CCA must be updated to reflect these activities. But rather than relying upon what are the mandatory provisions, it comes back to the idea of understanding the term of the CCA that you're signing or that you're negotiating for, to understand, is it a specific time period, or is it for life of tenure, for life of those activities. Being able to clearly understand what those activities are and what they're covered under the conduct and compensation agreement, and moving forward, if any new activities are planned or would like to be undertaken, that you negotiate a new agreement to build upon what you've already signed to make sure that you don't go back to the starting point. It's also important to look at the lifespan of the industry, and also to consider the impacts of scouting, the operation or the development phase, but also then the production phase when the wells will sit there pumping away over the years. It's important to ask the question of how often are those wells required to be revisited or looked at and inspected? Is it every couple of weeks, or is it every couple of years? Are any workover rigs required to recondition, reservice those wells? And how often will that take place? Also, weed and fire control around the well sites is an ongoing activity that's required. So it's a question of understanding at the negotiation point what are the likely impacts, or what's recommended is to develop that agreement for those exploration activities and then redevelop another agreement for the production activities moving forward as the impacts reduce, and making sure that the conduct provisions are maintained. I've tried to show you in this slide a breakdown of the phases that occur in this industry and what are some of the key points and considerations to take into place during that process. So like we said, we have the entry notice process, which is those preliminary activities only, and that agreement is not required prior to that entry taking place, but that landholders absolutely need to have a say about the timing, location and extent of those activities. And any questions or concerns, if you receive an entry notice or during that process, that you contact the company representative first, and if you're not satisfied with the response, then you go to the compliance unit to raise it as a complaint. Once we move into the advanced activities, we understand that a conduct and compensation agreement must be signed and is required prior to entry in those activities taking place, and that those necessary and reasonable legal, accounting and valuation costs are also covered by the resource company, and that you need to consider all of those property specific provisions. And it's not just about compensation, it's about getting the conduct provisions right and making sure that this level of activity is something that your business can continue to function but also that your lifestyles continue to function as well. It's important that you use all of that available advice to determine compensation, so that the company will come to you with a framework that they have developed or a strategy that they have developed in order to determine compensation. And as a landholder, you're entitled to use that advice that you're entitled to, so legal, accounting and valuation costs, as well as talking with people like grazing consultants and your banks. Other landholders have gone through this process and worked out compensation, as the impacts to one property are never the same as the impacts to another property, and these agreements are quite site-specific in essence, to make sure that they're specific and tailored to your circumstances. Once you move forward from those construction activities to develop the wells and install the roads and infrastructure, you then need to look at the production activities. So the production activities of the wells sitting there pumping away gas and water, but also whether they're inspected and reviewed, and making sure that as it is required, the production activities have a CCA to cover those. But also looking, like I said, the maintenance activities, the weed and prevention strategies, the workover rigs, and making sure that you discuss with the company to review the agreement periodically throughout that production framework, which may be 10 to 12 to 15 years, to make sure that the compensation is adequate, but also impacts that may be occurring are actually being addressed and covered by that agreement. As we spoke earlier about, the monitoring of bore conditions is absolutely critical for landholders. So taking a baseline assessment initially, but negotiating with the resource company to take ongoing assessments or to do ongoing monitoring of your bore, and making sure that you're not bearing the costs yourselves about that bore condition, but also, like we've also spoken about, the impact to roads and monitoring weeds and detecting any spread or disturbance of weeds is a critical component. When we look at the spread of weeds, we also need to understand the company may not have brought those weeds onto the property, for example, but if the weeds were already established on the property and as a result have spread from their disturbance or clearing of the sites, that those sort of impacts are actually addressed in the agreements, and making sure that early detection is the best process to do that. When we move into the rehabilitation process or the end of tenure process, this is not necessarily a question that is always addressed by landholders at the negotiation phase initially, but it may be something you choose to address now, or it may be something that you choose to address prior to the actual rehabilitation process. And it's important to understand that wells and sites will be progressively rehabilitated over the lifespan of the industry. So it may not be a process of once a 10-year period is up, for example, that all wells and infrastructure are removed. It may be that over that 10-year period or 12 or 15-year period, that sites are actually progressively rehabilitated as those activities cease to be relevant. So it's important to understand from the resource company what are their rehab requirements and what are their requirements under the environmental authority, but also as a landholder, what are your rehabilitation requirements, and making sure in the second option that reseeding of sites is actually done or used a species that is actually something that you actually want to be reseeded, instead of just using native pastures, which is maybe best practice. Actually returning the property to the original condition is something that you'd actually require. Progressive rehabilitation, as I've spoken about, and making sure that over this period that you and the company continue to review and monitor sites, but also that you review the final rehabilitation of any areas, and that you're required to sign off on that process. It's important to consider what are the actual sign-off times of that process against the growth period, but also how long afterwards, after the site has been rehabilitated, is the site going to be monitored, and by who is it going to be monitored, and if there are any outbreaks, then exactly who is liable for that process. And being able to remove some of this grey areas in the negotiation phase and putting in place specific provisions in your conduct and compensation agreement is one of the best ways to address this process. There is an ability for wells to be converted to water bores, either at the end of exploration or testing or production, but it's a process of negotiating that with the resource company and making sure that it's agreed upon, addressed, and something that's included in your agreement. So one of the questions that was asked was about landholder forums, where landholders can sit and share information and strategies of their conduct and compensation agreements with or without confidentiality. The quick answer to that question is there are a number of different landholder groups that have been set up by communities or a group of landholders working together to develop blanket conduct provisions or develop blanket land access arrangements. Through the project that I run and that we've been running over the last almost 4 years, we've done over 145 landholder workshops, and what we do, for those of you who haven't been to a workshop, it's a workshop from 9 o'clock till 1 o'clock, and what we do is we sit down and we go through all of this information and we actually facilitate the discussion between landholders to actually understand in their agreements what was an aspect that they liked or what was something that they didn't like, what advice can they share with others, and actually being able to use that experience that they have from their own circumstances to actually be able to help other landholders. Our project has funding up until the end of June next year, and over the next 6 months what I'll actually be doing is coming out to the regions and facilitating what we call advanced negotiation workshops, where I'll actually be sitting down with 10 to 15 landholders and going through your individual circumstances about questions or complaints that you have, being able to air your concerns in an environment where there won't be any company representatives or other representatives that aren't from myself, and being able to address those concerns and questions individually, and also being able to learn from each other and your experiences about what landholders can include. And throughout this process, one of the biggest questions or concerns that landholders continuously have is that there is a lot of information that you need to consider or that you need to address in your agreements initially. And I absolutely agree with that there's so much information, there are so many individual points to consider, it's almost impossible to be able to remember them all and address them in your agreement. So I'd absolutely recommend talking to friends, talking to neighbours, talking to other community groups, other landholders, using all the professional advice that you have available. You can call me or you can email me at any time that you'd like. I can provide free advice. We've seen over 3,500 landholders through this project and have developed a fairly good handle on what are some of the particular concerns that landholders have, but also what are some of the good conduct provisions to put in agreements. And unfortunately this afternoon we don't have enough time to go through all those provisions because we'll be there well into the midnight, but I hope that answers your question. So if you would like a workshop from myself in your town, all you need to do is go to the AgForce Projects website and register an expression of interest, or you can contact me directly with any particular concerns that you have and we can facilitate that. One of the other questions was about the responsibility for the well after it has been capped and abandoned, and how long will records be maintained over time, such as changes of ownership. One of the particular grey areas is about this long-term liability, but as part of the environmental authority process that companies are required to go through when they're seeking approval for those activities is actually paying a bond, a financial bond to the state government that the state government maintains in case the company goes bust or is unable to satisfactorily rehabilitate sites and the company holds that as a security. So that's one process that's addressed. In terms of liability, the resource company is required under the environmental authority to rehabilitate sites to a specified standard, and it's typically a best practice standard or a standard specified under regulations. What I would recommend to landholders is that it's important to understand exactly what those requirements are, and making sure that they meet a property-specific requirement. One of the potential impacts of the industry is the ongoing or long-term impacts in terms of groundwater impacts, and there are particular conditions attached to agreements such as sunset clauses when a tenure is being relinquished, that they actually need to develop and monitor any groundwater impacts moving forward, and develop those make-good strategies to cover those impacts. And if a make-good agreement is found to be ineffective or is found to actually not offset the impacts that are occurring, then the company is still held liable to fix up that impact. I hope that answers the question of long-term liability. If you need any more explanation, please let me know. Before we close the workshop, are there any other particular questions that anybody has, or any particular points that they would like to raise? On your screen are the upcoming workshops. So part of the project that we run, we do free property computer mapping workshops, and I'll be out in Miles, St George and Goondiwindi next week delivering those to everybody. If you'd like to attend, again, the details are on the AgForce Projects webpage, as well as the Biosecurity Field Day in Miles, and some regional planning days that we'll be holding in Roma and Dalby, where we'll actually be talking about what are the regional plans that have been developed by the Department of State Planning, and what are some of the technical aspects, and what are the implications for landholders around areas such as strategic cropping land. What protection does it provide for those activities, and moving forward for the resource industry, how will that impact on those activities? So we'll be discussing that in Roma on the 3rd of December and Dalby on the 4th of December. If there's no other questions, what I would like to do is thank everybody for your time this afternoon, and I hope that we've been able to address some of the questions. Some of the questions that I have not been able to address from the webinar today, I'll be taking those questions on note, and I'll be able to actually send you an email directly answering your question once I do a little bit of research. Again, thank you for listening and attending. Following the workshop this afternoon, it has been recorded, so we'll be sending you out via email in the next week the full recording of this workshop, as well as answering those questions that may need some further additional information. If you have any other additional questions or comments or concerns that you'd like to raise, please feel free to send them to me. My details are on the webinar now, as well as the details for the compliance unit. So I'm happy to follow up on any of those questions. And again, thank you for your attendance this afternoon.